Atheism. What does that word even mean? To some degree, the word itself doesn't seem to make sense. Even if we can make the word atheist make sense, we look at this word as an abstract. The word just means without. It comes from the Greek use of the words that you place a or without at the front and then theos. So it's atheos. So you get this in modern English, atheist. And while this is just a person that doesn't have an active belief in a God, to say atheism, to make that a group or a compound of people, or something similar to an ism like a sexism or some other isms, this sounds extremely strange. It's like a grouping of people by a basis of a thing that they don't believe in. Which is very strange to already identify somebody by a name of them not believing in a thing. Imagine having a name, let's say that you don't believe in fairies, and that we identify you subsequently as an atheist. And then, once you do accept that you guess by the definition of atheist that you are technically an atheist, then refer to those people as atheism and say, well, atheism is wrong. The whole use of this vocabulary seems just patently ridiculous to use the vocabulary like this. But this is something that the vocabulary winds up getting pushed all the time. It gets assigned to people from an outside group. Some other group identifies this group, and then they assign this name to it. And then because of the definitions, the group says, okay, I guess I meet that criteria. And then they become solidified as a group with this naming. I'll give you a primary example. The Native Americans here on the American continent, Christopher Columbus and earlier settlers refer to them as Indians. They finally owned it and just said, okay. But it wasn't something that they identified themselves as Indians. It was a misnomer to start with because they thought they landed in India. So it was a ridiculous name that eventually the natives here just said, okay, Indians. And they operated under those terms. And in the same way, I think non-believers or people who just don't actively have a belief, they finally did the same thing and said, okay, I guess by definition I am without a God. I don't have a God. Therefore, I'm atheist. And then this whole atheism, it's some group collective, started getting used as a vocabulary. And I think the vocabulary is ridiculous. Then it comes with all these misnomers. It comes couched with all kind of other ideas that religions invoke or push into this atheism. And we get this abstract terminology all the time now that atheism is wrong or atheism is philosophically inconsistent. And all atheism is, first of all, is a terminology that was defined by theists, not by non-believers. And then secondly, it's just not actively having a belief in a thing. If we started to define everybody by these subsets, by these groups, we would have people that didn't believe in fairies called atheists. Those that didn't believe in Bigfoot, we might refer to them as Asasquatchians. Or let's even group them even better. That's Asasquatchianism. That's a part of those Asasquatchianisms, or Asasquatchianist. Or then we could do people who don't believe in Santa Claus. We have Aclausians. Or a Clausianist. I'm not sure how you would do that one. But what you do is you just categorize people with a name for something that they don't actively have a belief in. This is not the same thing as believing that something might be damaging. I'll give you a primary example. You may be, by definition, an atheist, but you really wouldn't consider yourself an atheist. However, if this Atharianism, or this Farianism, I guess, started moving around and laws started being made based on the will of the fairies. If we started having the commandments of the fairies placed inside of the schools, or we started having some laws on what we could drink, or who we could have sexual partners with, or who we could marry and couldn't marry. And all of this was being dictated by someone who heard it from the fairies. Well, then you might become a little more anti-fairy in that you don't think whoever's talking to these fairies should be dictating laws or creating rule structures for schools or institutions or governments. And you might become a little more standoffish and more outspoken of an atheist and say, they'll categorize you then as, I guess, is a part of this atheianism. But really, you were always just didn't believe in a fairy is what's going on, and you're now getting named into a group. It's problematic. It's always been problematic. The name atheist should no more exist than an aclausian or aclausiast. It's a name that should not exist. It shouldn't have to exist to start with. But it does exist, and I guess the beat goes on. But this is something that's very different than an agnostic. An agnostic, it doesn't speak to whether they have an active belief in a thing or they don't have an active belief in a thing. Agnostic speaks to whether they believe that it can be known, whether the subject matter is inside of the paradigm of knowledge. Can it only be a belief, or can it be known in any epistemological sense? Can it meet the criteria that we generally put forward for knowledge? Whether you call that the justified true belief model or the tripartite model, or some other model of what you call knowledge and what the criteria to know a thing is. Agnostic simply means that they don't think that that's inside of the realm of knowing, whether they consider that just a non-falsifiable claim or whatever they consider it. Now, that's a different thing. I would say that it's not impossible that there are fairies. It seems ridiculous, but it's not impossible, I guess, or to my knowledge, it's not impossible that there are fairies. But do I have any reason to believe that there are fairies, or has there been anything that is presented in a way that I could know that there are fairies? No, nothing's been presented. And I could create a similar word to say that we don't know, or we can't know whether there are fairies or not fairies. Or you could pick another subject if you don't like fairies. You could do some other proposition of an invisible power or metaphysical thing, assign some characteristic to it and say it's outside of the paradigm of reality, that we can't really know whether it exists or not, and therefore we are agnostic towards that we can't know whether it's true or whether it's not true. And fair enough. But generally, it is the case that when we don't know if something is real or not, and we can't know it, that it's beyond our ability to know it in any epistemological or falsifiable sense, we generally don't believe it because we can't know it. That's not always the case. There are many people that they do believe it, even though they accept that it can't be known. There are Christians and there are even Muslims or others that they understand that the belief itself has to exist inside of the definition of a belief, that it isn't knowledge by definition, and that it can't be known, that it exists as a non-falsifiable claim, and so they are by definition agnostic, but that they still do believe it even though they are agnostic. Now, I will say that it's much more common that someone is agnostic and they are atheist, because they can't know whether it's true, then they don't adopt an active belief that this thing is true. But these are two different definitions. So you can be an agnostic and be an atheist, which is the most common. But you could also be an agnostic and be a theist or a deist or a polytheist. So this is something that can happen. These are two different things. But I think you can also be a theist or a deist or any of these other things and agnostic and still see that there are structures of religion and religion inside of societies and how they operate and the level of confidence that they bring that they think is damaging to a society. Even though they are believers, and even though they may be agnostic and believers, they still have something that many religions might categorize as anti-religious or anti-theist. That's not really what it is. What it is that they're seeing things inside of these theistic structures and these belief systems that are affecting society in a negative way. I'll give you a primary example. They may see things like saying what groups can do this or can't do that. They may see religious ideas that says that there's a pecking order, that the man is the head and that the woman is, the weaker vessel or something like this. And they may see this as something that is not morally tentable. And they may have many different problems that they see with the religious structure. And even though they are theist or monotheist or polytheist, they may have a problem with this, that they see issues with religion. This is different than atheists, a little different. The atheists that kick back and give a lot of resistance to religion is for the same reason that they see this as damaging. They might see things like hell and telling a child that they're going to burn in hell if they don't do this or do that. They might see that as something that is psychologically damaging and just ultimately not something that's good for society. And you can have someone that is a theist or a deist and thinks this is the case, or you can have someone that is an atheist and still thinks this is the case. But what happens is, more often than not, people who don't believe in a God, they have this constant push on them. Oh, well, of course you should believe there is a God. And then these arguments are given to them. Oh, well, this is why, this is why. And every argument that they get thrown at them, they find the argument completely unconvincing and uncompelling. So the more they get these arguments thrown at them, and the more they realize this is special pleading, you can't apply this logic to anything else. What if you applied this logic to the proposition of the invisible pink unicorn, or to any other, the flying spaghetti monster, or any other kind of whimsical parody of a god? Why wouldn't you apply this exact same logic to like Zeus or something? And the problem is that they see that these arguments they're not logical and they're not consistent, and they become more defensive, that they even have to defend that this isn't logical, to believe in an invisible power, that controls everything and that cares about, what we eat or who we sleep with. And these things aren't something that they can see as logical. And whether the deists that are also agnostic or have some problems with religions pushing these ideas, whether they have problems with them or not, they don't get grouped and get fought against in the same way and categorized as, oh, those are the atheists. They have this is atheism and there's some subculture. I think what you have is you have people that see a theocracy as problematic. Whether they are religious or whether they're not religious, whether they have some type of belief, and whether they, wouldn't die on that hill, so to speak, to say, positively there's a God. Maybe they just think they see the complexity of the world and they say, I don't know. It seems like something had to build it, but I don't buy all of this and all of that. And maybe they're just a deist, but they still wind up seeing these problems. It's just they don't get called out as much. And those people who see it as a problem and then they fight against it, they fight against a lot of this on the grounds that you're making these propositions and you're telling children that they're going to go to hell, and you're trying to make all these laws and determine who can get married and who can't get married, who has hierarchy in a relationship and who doesn't. And you're doing all of this predicated on what is essentially a fairy story, that we don't know whether there is even such an individual to start with. And that's an argument that atheists wind up taking on more. And it's two different things, though. It's two different things. It's a different thing to, you don't have an active belief. It's a different thing, agnostic, that you don't think it's a subject that can be known. And really, anybody that understands anything about epistemology or understands what the standard or criteria for knowledge is or what falsifiability is, they'll generally come to some consensus. Yes, in the strictest sense of knowledge, it cannot be known. It is beyond the reach of epistemology. It's beyond the reach of falsifiability. But those people still might be religious. They may not be religious. So I think you'll see agnosticism a lot more. But the people who think if you can't know a thing, then why would you believe a thing? Then they take the position, well, I don't actively believe it because I can't actively know it. If I believed everything that I couldn't actively know, I would believe in fairies. I'd believe in, all of these other things. We could come up with things all day long. We could do the Bertrand Russell's teapot all day long, because you can't actively know that thing is true. Why would you believe that thing if you can't know it? Well, some people may just have a propensity to it, that they want to believe it or it adds something to their life, and fair enough. But the people that generally would concede that it is an agnostic point, that you really can't know it, they're not what you would generally run into as the fundamentalist kind of problem that push these things into churches or push these things into government. They're not why you couldn't buy alcohol on Sundays in the South, or why you couldn't gamble unless you were on a ship. And the ship used to have to, I know in Mississippi and in Gulf Coast, it used to have to push off, and you couldn't even, roll the dice until you were out on international waters, because religious people in Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, this was sinful, and the states had to make laws on it. This type of fundamentalism is not something that you would generally get from an agnostic, even if they are an agnostic believer. That's not something that they would so strongly stand on, that this is immoral, when they can't even define, the reason that it is immoral. But this is two different categories, atheism and agnosticism, and then you run into a third category, which I won't even call it anti-religious or anti-theist. It's just a category that they see a problem with the religious ideology and religious laws, and pushing religion into schools, pushing religions into government, pushing them into our legal systems, and making determinations of how society has to operate based on these religious ideas. This group of people exist whether they're religious or not religious, whether they're believers or not believers, but you'll see it more so in those that don't even have an active belief. It gets magnified because to them, not only is this ridiculous to say, who you could have as a partner or who you can marry, but they don't even have an active belief in an artificer that makes a decision that this is right or wrong. So they don't have a basis in which they can condemn many of these actions as immoral to start with. So you might get a little more pushback from them, and you can call these people anti-theist or anti-religious if you want, but they're anti-theocracy is what they really are. And anti-theocracy is not a purely atheistic or agnostic position. There are many theistic people that are anti-theocracy. They may believe in God, but they don't want laws of their land to be dictated around the idea of a God, or say, well, this God said you can't do this or you can't do that, and then determine what clothes people should wear, how long their skirts should be, and everything else. This is a theocracy, and many people that are even religious, they don't want this. But I think the majority of the gatekeepers that make sure that this doesn't happen, it generally winds up falling to the shoulders of those that are atheists, or at very least to those that are agnostic. But this is the short of the differential between the three primary categories of what goes on online. Thank you.